I'm going to look at the particular type of inquiry that we do around fieldwork. And there'll be some overlaps with what Margaret's said earlier on. But there's also something I think that comes across in the specifications as being quite different about fieldwork. And in fact, one of the awarding organisations in the new specifications in England even talks about the inquiry, as though that's the only time you do inquiry. It's when you go out into the field. And it's interesting that the way in which different people interpret inquiry, I've always interpreted inquiry in the same way as Margaret does. It's a kind of a holistic view towards teaching and learning, and fieldwork is simply an aspect of it. But I think fieldwork poses particular questions and particular challenges, particularly as we, certainly in England, smash the last bottle of Prosecco or whatever you want to smash against the bow of the good ship controlled assessment as it sails off into the sunset. But of course Wales has kept a version of it in a way. It's slightly different from the English versions, as I'll explain. And so what I want to try and talk about, and it feeds into the session I'll be running this afternoon on what I've still got to get my head around the acronym, the NEA. I still prefer the term individual study or individual investigation, because I think that's what it is. But I think it's important that we give some thought as to how we move towards independent work and independent thinking. And I'm sure there'll be some ripple effects from what we discuss in this session and this afternoon that will get us thinking probably across the whole of the secondary curriculum. But I'm going to focus on GCSE and about how we can engage learners in the whole inquiry process, because I don't think we've done that with controlled assessment for all kinds of reasons that I'll try and explain. And I want to try and work out ways with you about ways in which we can both generate some independence, and it doesn't have to be mind-breaking. It's not difficult. Rather like Margaret's activities this morning, there'll be very practical ways. But also students have unique experiences, and with the Welsh specs and the EduCast version in England as well, you need to think about what the student's unique experience of fieldwork and what they've done in fieldwork, how that relates to their wider understanding. So, to give you an example, if you're studying in the Welsh GCSEs, the concept of flows, or in EduCast, the concept of flows, how does that relate? You can do that flows of people in the centre of Cardiff, you could do that flows of water in a river, all kinds of ways in which we look at flows. How do you relate that then to, say, a migration map showing flows of people between different economic regions of the UK? And how do we get students to think more widely about flows? So I'm going to try and deal with at least some of those points, particularly the point about independence and its relationship with wider understanding. I think that there are always reasons with fieldwork why we get the welly boots on and go out and measure rivers, or we get the clipboards out and we go and do environmental quality surveys or questionnaires. I think sometimes also we need to, David Jobe, who worked at the Institute of Education for a number of years and whose special interest really was fieldwork, and the Field Studies Council are really interested in taking students to kind of quite special environments. They believe that fieldwork ought to have a kind of wow factor as well. It's hard to have a wow factor when you're up to your wellies in stream water and you're trying to get the dog bone the dog biscuit and prevent it from disintegrating because you're on the sixth measurement that day. But I think you've got some wonderful environments particularly within physical geography. You've got Snowdonia, you've got the Brecon Beacons, to name just two. And I think sometimes we can take students and use fieldwork as a way of getting them out into very special environments. And I think geography ought to offer some students to do a little bit of what I call look-see, and what David Jobe used to call look-see, just to go and see special places. I do some fieldwork trips for students in East London, working towards the individual investigation. And Canary Wharf and the City of London, quite special wow environments to take students. And I'm sure for many of his students to come to Cardiff. I know Margaret's going to mention more about Cardiff this afternoon, about growing up in Cardiff, and what a special kind of place that is too for many students. It's the capital and that great sense of place. But I think for most of what we do in fieldwork as far as GCSE concerned, we probably do go out to collect data. And it might be relating links between geology and landforms, or it might be looking at what happens to rivers. It might be spheres of influence about where people have come from to shop in Cardiff or Swansea. But I do think it's important for students to be involved in the whole inquiry process, and that's what I want to focus on. Because Ofqual insisted on 6 stages and spelling out 6 stages of fieldwork. Margaret talked about 4 stages of inquiry, and she talked about the overlap between what she means by inquiry in the classroom and what's different about these 6 processes. But I think when you look at these 6, they offer a very good model of what we do at Fieldwork and what we aim to do at Fieldwork. But I think controlled assessment has taken away some of these, so that, for instance, understanding of the kinds of question capable of being investigated through fieldwork and the geographical inquiry processes. As soon as you've, for the last few years, been looking up on the Educas or WJEC website to see what the 2016 task is or the 2015 task is, and you've chosen your task or you've chosen your question for investigation, that's taken out of the hands of students completely. It's something that you have done to you as teachers. And probably you're thinking, as soon as you've chosen your title or your topic or your question, once you've chosen it, you think, well, we'll go out and we'll do these things, these methods of collecting data. So if you decide to test the Bradshaw model, for instance, and you look at rivers and how the rivers change downstream, you've got various ways that you help students out with measuring the flow of rivers and measuring width and depth to calculate discharge and so on. And again, students don't get involved in that. And so where students really start to come in is when they do the things that you ask them to do. So if you like, the tail end of stage 2, and then when they get into processing and presenting fieldwork data. It's one of the very few times they get any real chance for individuality. And some students, you just churn out a whole sort of pile of different sorts of graphs. They work their way along the menu of pie charts that Excel will generate for them. And they're running out of ideas when you start getting donut graphs and things like that, or cone graphs, pictograms of the most weird and wonderful shape. But it's a kind of, that's their strike for independence, really. And that's where we tell them that sometimes we pick out words from mark schemes. One of the awarding bodies uses the word sophisticated. And if you're going to get to the top level band, you've got to explain students. And they say, well, how many sophisticated? And at no stage are they really thinking about what their engagement with is inquiry. They're looking for you for guidance. How do I get the top level marks? And so we come about this in a very strange way. And actually, the samples of work I see, I work for one of the awarding bodies every year, have done so for years in moderating GCSE controlled assessment. Most of the schools make a really valiant effort at producing some damn good geography, really good geography. And it's when students get into analysis that if you're turning over, if I'm trying to compare, say, a student that's got 32 out of 50 with one that's got 42 out of 50, you can see real differences, and the students really have tried to work hard at listening to what you've told them about how to analyse data well, and they've drawn conclusions. But sometimes they trip up when they get to this stage. If their velocity got slower as they went downstream, or you took them out in mid-September or late September in year 11 after a dry summer, we should wish and be so lucky. But anyway, after a dry summer and the rivers are actually getting sometimes, particularly if you've got a bit of blooming chalk or limestone in the area and the water starts seeping underground and your discharge gets lower, are they going to be the one to say that Bradshaw is wrong? A 15-year-old student, me, a 15-year-old student, do I say that Bradshaw's wrong, or do I say my results didn't work out? And I better say, well, my conclusion shows that rivers do get faster downstream, even though in brackets mine didn't, because they daren't be the ones to quiz it. And we're kind of imposing this structure on them about getting them to think in particular ways. And it comes up even more. Most students really don't do terribly well on evaluation. And part of the reason for that is because I think it's very challenging. If if your school and your department think about Bloom's taxonomy in any way, it is a really challenging part to be able to reflect and evaluate. But the trouble is, in a way, you're the person they're evaluating, because you picked the blooming task to do. You gave them the methods. Are they going to tell you that their methods were wrong? So you get things like, my paper got wet and I couldn't write with my pen. Or, you know, the dog biscuit broke up in the stream because we'd already used it 5 times and it turned into a load of mush and we had to find something else. And you get that kind of level of evaluation. And it's because, in a way, that's what we've asked them to do. And do they want to challenge you as the teacher? And there's some real challenge, I think, in having these 6 stages of fieldwork opened up to us as teachers. And how do we get students thinking about the kinds of question that might be investigated through fieldwork? How do we actually do that? If you've decided that you're, for instance, you know, Welsh Board, if they said to you, right, 2019, for instance, they're going to assess flows, one of their key techniques. You know, well, actually, are you going to get students thinking about that? Well, actually, the idea is that yes, yeah, if you can, do. So we'll think about that. We'll have some discussion in a minute about that. But in a sense, we present the inquiry process as shown in those 6 stages there, not so much as 6 stages. We tend to think of it, and the whole kind of process of inquiry that Margaret was talking about this morning, it's part of this bigger picture, that we do pose questions. Perhaps you might sort of start at 12 o'clock on this diagram, and we go through the process of collecting data, processing, presenting, etc., and we evaluation. But actually, in an ideal world, and in a sense what the challenge is, particularly at the 6th form, is how do we get students to pose those questions? And they probably won't do it if they're just presented, rather like Margaret said this morning, they don't come in burning. You didn't come in burning with knowledge this morning and a desire to know about life expectancy. But within 5-10 minutes, Margaret had achieved that, and you were discussing wildly about, you know, what the countries were with the highest or lowest life expectancy. So, in a sense, you were using all the things and the experience that you brought into the room with you this morning in order to try and do that. And so she wasn't just posing a question. You were geography teachers that walked into the room with all this behind you. And in a sense, that's when it works really well. So how, therefore, do we set up students and put them in a situation where they're open, they're invited into the questioning process, they're invited into the inquiry process, particularly in respect of doing fieldwork. And then, perhaps, if we do that successfully, and they start planning and thinking about the questions and planning methodology, then hopefully what they'll be able to do is evaluate the process, and they'll be thinking, well, that didn't work out very well. Yeah, or that did work out really well. We better find a better way of doing that next time. And I think the dialogue becomes a different dialogue. But I don't think that controlled assessment, as we've had it for the last few years, is really perhaps the way to achieve that. And I do think, to reinforce what Margaret said, sorry Margaret, your name appears on this slide as though you're not in the room. It's one that I used in a GA lecture last year, that, you know, in a sense we've got to recognise where students are and where they're coming from if we're going to see inquiry as a kind of whole process and an approach to learning that isn't just about fieldwork and the inquiry, as one of the specification puts it. But actually, we're going to think about the ways in which students do ask questions and get into their heads. And if we've got year 10, 11s who tend to give slightly perhaps grunty one-word answers, you know, how do we explore that a little bit more and get them used to talking and questioning in a dialogue with us? Because I really don't think controlled assessment has really helped that process. I think it was set up to save fieldwork. Now, back in the day, David Blunkett, who was Education Minister, actually wanted to do away with fieldwork and didn't see it as a necessity to have it as a requirement for geography. A desirable, yes, but not a requirement. And I think combined with that, so that, you know, the political fight was there to fight for fieldwork, as it has been this time around as well. So the GA and the RGS, IBG got on board for that. But the other thing that, you know, even Michael Gove was very suspect about coursework of any sort, is this pressure to deliver progress measures. You know, you've got SLT on your backs all the time, I'm sure, to develop, you know, real progress reports on students. And the way in which it's worked out over the last 7 or 8 years is that now 73% of students nationally in England and Wales get grade C or above in controlled assessment. And that compares with about 58, 59% in written examinations. So does that mean that controlled assessment's easier? Well, of course it doesn't. It means that students don't have the time constraint. It's a whole different range of skills. But when you're looking at it politically, it looks as though it stands out as though controlled assessment is easy. And of course, you feel as teachers, if you've got to report better progress measures, that it's the chance that you've got where you can control part of the process to get students the result that they want and that ideally you want as well. And it's left us in a situation where, for instance, students who do well at foundation tier, if they do very well in controlled assessment, they can leap over that B hurdle, that grade B hurdle, and come out with grade Bs instead of the ceiling grade C that foundation tier has always placed upon us. So I don't think we should underestimate that, but I think we have to work with that and just assume that it's there. But I think my argument really says that all those processes together have really closed down the inquiry process as far as most students are concerned. And if I just simplify, this was a version I did for another GA talk a couple of years ago, but I think what we've done is really turn a lot of controlled assessment just into a kind of, instead of an inquiry process, we've focused mainly on these things, on these particular skills. And students have been quite comfortable with that. Somebody said this morning, students do like being told what to do. And if they can be told not the answers, but the way to get to the answers in a fairly simple way, they're quite happy with that. It's like in my last school, sixth formers used to turn around to me and say, for goodness sake, all these activities and things that we do, can't you just tell us? It's what the head of economics does. And one of the students held up his handout he'd had from the previous lesson. He said, we sit and talk about football, and we just learn from our handouts. And I was furious. But that's what students are getting, and they like being led to the answers in the easiest way possible. You're going to have a problem to tackle that one. And that's Margaret's wider cycle. Actually, Margaret was saying yesterday and last week in Manchester that this I'll get you to perhaps explain, Margaret, in a minute as to why you've taken the links out of these. But Margaret, in the first book, Learning Through Inquiry, was that the? Learning Through Inquiry, set these stages out as which she used in the title of her activities in her talk this morning, creating a need to know, and about using data, and about making sense. And then there's the process of reflecting on learning as well. And really what we've done in controlled assessment, I think, is these stages, these bullets in red. And we've perhaps turned it into a cyclic process through the process we've imposed through GCSE. Margaret, would you just like to explain why you took out the arrows?
Creating a need to know to me was about being curious and staying curious, not just at the beginning of a unit of work, but right the way throughout. And you might have to rekindle that curiosity some way through this. Kindle curiosity in the data, kindle curiosity in the making sense. And you might use data right at the start as a starter activity to create the need to know. And so I thought, in my mind, it became more complicated than how I set it out as a sequence, and that you could use data at the start and make sense of that data at the start and then go through that. And so I decided that the stages were there. If people wanted to put the arrows, they couldn't. So I reproduced the same diagram in this, but without the arrows, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. I think one of the problems that we have sometimes with fieldwork, particularly with students who are less confident, it might be middle ability, lower ability candidates, even high ability candidates. Margaret was just mentioning as teacher in the Singapore group that she'd been, who was concerned that Margaret was sometimes interchanging words to mean the same thing to do with inquiry. Yeah. And drew concept maps that didn't always look the same in every session, and he wanted to get the right answers each time. Sometimes fieldwork and the data we collect aren't clear-cut, they're messy. Velocity data along a river is the obvious example, where sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down between different points. So we introduce students to the concept of best fit. But what if the velocity do go down, and Bradshaw said it had gone up, or it ought to go up? So I think students start getting confused about this, and they therefore don't think critically. They're inclined to blame themselves or think our inquiry was wrong. And that kiboshes the whole idea of this wider geographical idea that you're after with the new WJEC fieldwork requirements. Now, in terms of fieldwork requirements, this is where things get slightly sort of different. So those of you, who was it who said you're teaching Edexcel GCSE? Was it, you're teaching the Edexcel A levels. Anybody doing Edexcel GCSE or AQA? You're doing AQA, yeah, right. Okay, thank you. And OCR. Okay, so it's not two of us. Anybody doing Educas England as opposed to WJEC Wales? Okay, right. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to address these next few points to are really the teachers who are teaching the Welsh WJEC specification, but it's also true for the Educas English specification. It's just examined in a very different way. So what Andy Owen devised was a series of fieldwork methodologies which would be, I would use the word rotated. It sounds as though there's a particular order to it. You'll know in advance what the order is and what's going to be assessed in a particular year. But choosing one of several methodologies and choosing one of several concepts. So concepts that we use, like, for instance, sustainability. But once you know your methodology, so I've used the example two and, say, spheres of influence already, you're free to choose your fieldwork, you're free to choose your location. You could go to two separate days in different environments. We might perhaps traditionally call that one physical, one human, but it doesn't have to be. It might be 2 days in a single location. You might go to Aberystwyth, you might go to Snowdonia or somewhere like Tenby or come into Cardiff and then down to Penarth to the coast. And you choose the topic or the focus for the inquiry. Do you want to use rural tourism or do you want to use rivers? It really is as open as that. So there's an element here which I think is reintroducing teacher professionalism. I think controlled assessment has actually deprofessionalised us quite a bit. We've done what we're told to. But I think also you can generate, and that's where the students come in, perhaps questions for investigation. The students have to do 2 pieces of fieldwork, and you'll know basically that they have to, the key date is really the 31st of October because things change on the 1st of November in year 11. And students do their 2 pieces of fieldwork, and WJEC set questions that focus on aspects of the inquiry process. Now, by aspects of the inquiry process, I mean those 6 stages. So any of those could be examined in any year, and there's no set minimum, there's no set maximum. You might in a year have all 6, you might have in a year 1 or 2. But the questions will be based on those stages. And they must do those. That's the stage of analysis under high level of control. So they go through the stage of doing their data collection and presenting their results. And then the questions focus from the aspects of fieldwork from then onwards, and they can have their portfolio of results with them. But it must be done under high level of control. They've got a maximum of 2 hours, 30 minutes. And I don't know whether you'll cheer this or not. WJEC, not teachers, will mark the responses. They'll actually get parcelled off and they go to WJEC for marking by December the 31st. So your decision is, once you know which technique and which concept is being assessed in which year, it's a matter of designing your fieldwork accordingly, and that really is as free and as open as you wish it to be. It can be set, it can be, if you want, you can you could even go down for instance, the Edexcel route, where they've got a choice of teachers for Edexcel GCSE in England, have a choice of rural or urban and rivers or coasts. It's as limited as that. But you may want to be open. You might want to have a look at some of the guidance from the other awarding bodies, because OCR and AQA in England say you can do whatever you want. Do any topic. And so by nature the questions are therefore going to be quite open about, for a piece of fieldwork you've carried out. But you can design questions around, for instance, it might be a question like, how should coastal communities on the North Wales coastline be protected from sea level rise? It might be linked to something you've taught about. Or what are the impacts of tourism on the economy and environment of Brecon? Or which recent developments in Cardiff are most sustainable? So you can design the questions, and they really can be quite broad, open questions like that, provided that the students are involved in looking at their flows and their concepts. Now you've got different models. You might have a flows day if flows are what you're doing, or you might have a sphere of influence day if spheres of influence are what you're doing. Or you might go to a rural environment and spend half the morning, half the day looking at flows and half the day looking at sphere of influence. And then you might go to an urban environment, you might go to Swansea and again look at flows in a different way, so it might be flows of people and then spheres of influence to do with, it might be retail or journey to work, as you wish. It could be 2 separate days of fieldwork, it could be 4 half days of fieldwork, it could be a residential field trip if you're lucky enough to have students who don't sort of face financial burdens like that, but that is obviously the costliest version of those, but it really is as open as that. The one regulation is it must be beyond the school grounds. And that's to try and sort of stop head teachers just sort of saying, well, look, you can do it around the school. It is to get students out, even if it's only within the community around the school. Anyway, I think there are some implications, I think, for you in your department. I think there are also some implications for teaching. I think some of you have highlighted already that to get students familiar with the environment, I think, is important. And I think it's also important perhaps to go out practicing. Don't be afraid to run pilots. If you want students to get the data right, you can use the school grounds, for instance, for preparation. Flows around the school during break time or lunchtime, that kind of thing. The only thing, as I say, you must finish phase 1 of the coursework by October 31st in year 11, in the year of the examination. And students can keep a portfolio. They don't need to write up a full report. You might think that actually they might do better. If you want to practice a report, that's entirely your decision. You might just think, well, actually, I'm just going to take students as far as setting out a kind of context statement about the area we went to and what they were aiming to do, and a methodology, and then data presentation. If you want to go through the full analysis and conclusions, you can do. That's entirely for you. So the approaches, the methodologies are shown here. And as you'll see that there are 4 of them. Use of transects. They're shown in the sample assessment materials and will be assessed in 2020. Change over time, qualitative surveys and geographical flows. And similarly, quite a nice one to sort of start off with, not too much difference between the concepts, cycles and flows for 2018. And then place as a concept in 2019. Margaret's idea of photographic placing, place connections and changing places, be really lovely technique for that, and some other things she'll show you this afternoon. Sphere of influence in 2020, but you've also got mitigating risk, sustainability and inequality. Inequality has always been a real favourite with WJC coursework in the past on contrasting quality of life within cities and settlements. So that'll be a popular one. You'll already have many tools at your disposal to look at those. Anyway, final part of the discussion. What kinds of fieldwork are you planning for 2018? Flows and cycles and flows. Just a little bit of discussion on that for a few minutes before we finish for lunch. And then how far will it be possible to generate some independent learning in your fieldwork when you're doing that? Right, I'm going to show you Andy's resources first of all, because he reckons that take the technique or take the concept, you ought to be able to go to the same place year in, year out and explore that technique. So for instance, measurement of flow might be measuring velocity and calculating discharge, fine, over a river. Use of transect might be just measuring the width and depth to get channel transects. Qualitative surveys, annotation of photos or field sketches, perceptions of environmental quality, but again still in the same area. And then change over time, particularly useful, I don't know if it's useful so much along the river, except environmental agency data. Use of photos, use of data collected in previous fieldwork, so you might accumulate data over a number of years. Fat lot of good in year 1, but nonetheless, the environmental quality to look at peak flows and on past events and change over time there. Good if you're going to a coastline. You mentioned, Daniel, you were going to Tenby, and to maybe look at particular parts of Tenby and how it might have changed both as a place. Measurement of flows, I think this photograph has done the rounds in most WJEC Educast training for about the last 5 years. I seem to see this one pop up whenever I want a WJEC photograph to use, so it's not copyright protected. Measurements of flows, it could be traffic flows, transects could be from the CBD or across a settlement, to look at factors influencing quality of life. Similarly, qualitative surveys about environmental quality or photo and field sketch annotations and change over time. Again, what Margaret will show you, see some lovely examples of older Cardiff where you might want to use change over time using photos. Now there are guidance notes. I'm not stepping away from the. I realise I've been set a challenge about cycles. So cycles and flows, for instance. You've got within urban environments the ebb and flow of traffic during the day, or ebb and flow of pedestrians, I think is a nice one, and that's doable if you're in a settlement for probably realistically 3-4 hours on a fieldwork day, if you're lucky. Urban environments about movement of sediment along a shore, or changes in cliff forms. You've got, well, that's sustainable communities, which is a future one. Andy puts this down as urban environments. I reckon that looks like our village shopping ground pound, but anyway, we'll say that's an urban environment nonetheless. Together with, say, coastal flooding, and then you've got mitigating risk. Again, stretches of coastline, urban environments here, mitigating risk of, say, crime might be an idea. So I think that, that there are certainly the intentions that you can go to the same areas year in, year out and use those. But I think the cycles and flows, I would make that really quite mechanistic for the first year and try and work in. It might be cycles and flows of tourists and sort of ebb and flow of tourists through the year. If you can get tourist data, you may well have to go for secondary data for some of those, because clearly you're in a place for one day. And that's not much good, if you want data over a period of time.